Okay. So if you remember on Friday, we were looking at early Christian work, and we were seeing how they were really just borrowing from pagan imagery, right? So remember the syncretism, this idea of taking imagery that belongs to someone else and transforming it and giving it new meaning, right? We will see artists do this in contemporary society, but when we look at it for the like older pieces, we have a slightly different term for it. So images of like the Good Shepherd were painted on the ceilings of catacombs. So we have the catacombs of Priscilla, where this Good Shepherd image, and when you look at it, he looks totally Roman. What are the Roman characteristics about him again? Go ahead and chit chat with each other. Kind of try to wake ourselves up a little bit. What's Roman about him? We're focusing on the painting that's at the Catacomb of Priscilla. Go ahead. Okay, what do you think? What's Roman about him? Hinge.
It's kind of like his position of like his speaking out, and then Gideon has like kind of like the casket of like having the sheep on his shoulder.
Right. So he's wearing a toga, right? That lets me know he's Roman. His arm is outstretched as if he's speaking. We saw that on the Augustus of Prima Porta, as well as our Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. We have a goat, that one's a goat, across his shoulders, very similar to how we see Apollo or Hermes images in classical Greece. Even the contrapposto, right? Look at his pose. He has a shifting of weight and classical fabric, okay? So sculptures, there's not a lot of sculptures from this time. Part of it, and part of the reason that there's not a lot of early Christian work, is that we think because in the Old Testament, there is a scripture about graven images, part of the commandments, and you shouldn't worship graven images. And so a lot of pieces that were made were incredibly small. I was taught that if it couldn't cast a large shadow, then it was okay. And so pieces like this, Good Shepherd images that represent Jesus, were really, really tiny. They would be like tabletop sculptures instead of full-size sculptures that we've seen for a lot of the Greek and Roman images. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this does relate to what we'll move into a little bit later. This is Santa Costanza, and Santa Costanza was a church and a mausoleum for Constantine's daughter. So Constantine's daughter was a Christian, and when she died, she had this mausoleum built for her. And if you look at the architecture of it, does it remind you of any other classical structures that we've seen? Things with domes and rotundas. What do you think? What's it similar to? What's it similar to? Paris.
Well, the way that this kind of like two stories, it kind of reminds me of the treasury.
Right? It has the two stories like the treasury, but that roundness of it is very similar to the Pantheon. And so we still have a vocabulary that's very classical because these are still Roman people, right? Constantine's daughter was Roman, right? Even if the empire shifts, right, and changes. On the inside of this mausoleum, it has a beautiful mosaic ceiling. And the mosaic ceiling has a portrait bust of her floating in it. It has scenes of an orchard and harvesting of grapes. And her as a Christian would see imagery like this, and it would remind her of the Eucharist, the idea of the wine representing the blood of Christ, right? So it's symbolic of that. But her husband, who remained a pagan, might look at it and see Bacchus, right? The god of celebration and wine. And so once again, a lot of these images have dual meaning to them. Ravenna was an outpost of the Eastern Empire. So the Roman Empire, remember, it moved from Rome to Constantinople, but there was an important strategic location in northern Italy called Ravenna. And the structure itself is pretty unassuming on the outside, but on the inside are some beautiful mosaics. This once again was a mausoleum dedicated to the sister of not Constantine, but another later emperor. And the inside of it has some early depictions of Christian art, like the gospel writers, right? And it has this image of Jesus. And the reason I show this to you is I want to really see the evolution of how Jesus is portrayed in the Christian tradition. So we just saw him as Apollo or Hermes, right? We saw him as a classical figure, right? We see him as a path-bearer. Now we see it taken up a notch. What are some of the emblems that tells us he's holy or he's powerful? Remember our characteristics of power? Regina, give me one. Huh? He's got a halo. This guy has a full round golden halo, right? Golden halo. What else tells us he's powerful? Yes.
In the center and all the sheep are focused on him.
Right? He's in the center and all the sheep are looking at him. Anything else? He's holding a staff, but instead of it being a weapon, what is it? It's a cross. So it's a symbol of salvation and a symbol of his death. And he's wearing gold robes, right? So all of it, we see him moving from a mere shepherd to something more holy. He still is in charge of his flock, right? We see his flock around him. And so there's a lot of classical characteristics to this mosaic. Even the layering of space in a landscape sort of form is very Roman-esque. Okay, so we can start to see that transformation. Here's one that's like 80 years later, right? Notice the difference here. He's got the nimbus or the Trinity halo. So you can see it's divided into 3 with a cross behind it. And then what color is his robes? Yeah, purple. Who's only allowed to have purple during this time in history? Emperors, kings. Oh, thank you, Suri. She really looked it up for me. He's wearing royal robes. So he's the king of heaven, right? And this color of purple was reserved to royalty. It came from a mollusk and it was very, very rare. And so here we see him portrayed as more kingly, okay? Now I had mentioned when we looked at the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus that I would show you other images. These are kind of those transitional images. When we look at it, if you are Christian, you would recognize it as maybe like baptism at the river, right? And the teaching of like scriptures, right? You see a calf bearer, you see someone laying on the river here. But as a pagan, I might see a philosopher, I might see a river god, right? So a lot of these were able to be used for Christians and non-Christians. This is a really famous sarcophagus, and it has classical architecture. And then in each of these little niches, it's got illusionism, or not illusionism, but it has little depictions of the life of Christ in it. So it has scenes of him throned on top of the God of heaven, right? So a pagan god there. It has scenes from the New Testament. So it has scenes of him entering Jerusalem. It has scenes of Pontius Pilate, but it also has scenes from the Old Testament, like Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve considered, they had the first sin. So it is a representation for the need of Christ to forgive all sins through his death. And so this is definitely a Christian sarcophagus. Hello. We can see allusions to earlier pieces of relief sculpture in these pieces. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to sacred spaces and rituals. We're going to look at how early Christians adapted Roman secular architecture to create Christian sacred spaces. Okay, so the development of the Christian church. This is a little bit of context. I don't think you need to write it in your note takers, but I just want to give you a little bit of background. We had mentioned that Constantine, right? Constantine made Christianity legal, right? As well as other forms of religion in the Edict of Milan. He wasn't necessarily a Christian until probably his deathbed, but he did see, like other Christian or other Roman emperors, the need to keep people happy. And so one of the things that he did is he was the patron of a lot of church construction all around the empire. In the city of Rome, even though that's not where he was, we think he's the patron of two major churches, St. John the Lateran, which is still there. You can go to St. John the Lateran today. It is a very old, early Christian church in a basilica format. It has some beautiful mosaics to it, and it is considered the Cathedral of Rome. Remember that the Vatican is its own separate country. It is not really a part of Rome, but it is the head of the Catholic Church in Rome. And actually the bishop, who's the head of the region, is the Pope at St. John the Lateran because of proximity. And then he also was the patron of the old St. Peter's, the first St. Peter's that was demolished to build the one that we have today, right? That was the site of the crucifixion of Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus. So Constantine built a lot of early churches. The Vulgate was created in 404. This was one of the very first compilations of the Bible, because the Bible is a series of different books. It's different books that were put together. And so we have them put together in around 404, and it was translated from Hebrew to Latin by St. Jerome. And so that spread the word of Christianity around the empire. And we start to see churches developing and being built, because early churches were inside the home. People went to different people's houses to worship, but they decided they needed bigger structures to meet for bigger gatherings. And so we have different church construction happening. Okay, so which buildings did Christians borrow from the Romans for their churches? Did they build temples or use temples, or did they use basilicas? And why would they do that? Does anyone know? If you look in your note takers and you look at the next image, skip here so I can see which one it is. It's Santa Sabina. Which one do you think it is? It's a basilica format, okay? So Christians like to borrow from paganism, right? They like to borrow it. However, for the structures and for the buildings, they did not want to take temples. Temples were houses of the gods, and they did not want to necessarily use those religious structures. So instead, they used they used secular architecture. A basilica was a public building, right? It was a public building that they could use, and it had some really cool additions to it. This is a basilica, right? A Roman basilica. It's a civic building. This is a Christian church based on that basilica format, okay? Why is a basilica a good format for a church? Okay, it is longitudinal, right? We can have processions go down to an altar area, and you can use the apse, one of those rounded areas, as your altar area, okay? And then you can have seating in the center and seating in the side aisles. And you can also have it so that people can walk on the side aisle, and it's kind of like if a service is taking place, you're not really like in the middle of it causing disruption. Okay, and so there's a lot of areas and spaces that really help to promote the religion. Okay, So we can have everyone kind of facing one direction for mass, right? And so there's two different kinds of structures that were very typical in this type of time in history. The basilica format, right, which we have just looked at, but also the central plan church. The central plan church is kind of in the form of a Greek cross, okay? So it has like a Greek cross and often has a dome over the central area. So like Santa Costanza was a good example of that. Okay. Another component that I haven't mentioned is that a lot of these churches have atriums on the outside. Remember, an atrium was very typical for even Egyptian homes, but also Roman homes. It's kind of like this outdoor space. These are houses for God, right? And so it makes sense that they would have some similar structures to them. People could gather in these courtyards, these atriums, before they entered the church, okay? And then you would enter into what we call the narthex. That's the entryway into a church. And then you would go into the center aisle, which is called the nave. And then we have side aisles, and then we have an apse at the end. We have a plan we'll look at in our study guides in just a moment, where we can fill that out when we get to Santa Sabina. Okay. So this is a reconstruction of old St. Peter's. This is the one that Julius II in the Renaissance had demolished and had it rebuilt. And so it was on a raised platform, very Roman-like, right? Had a raised platform with a central staircase that led you into kind of like a propylaea, a gatehouse. Then it led to an atrium with a fountain so that you could kind of clean yourself before you enter the house of God. There was this really large narthex, and then you would enter in. Now, this church was enormous. It was the mother church of Catholicism. It was enormous. It was said to hold like 14,000 people at one time. So it could house a lot of people. It had an entryway. This is just an illustration of what we think it looked like, but it did have a lot of classical characteristics to it. It had columns, it had marble, it had a flat ceiling, right? It had double side aisles. Instead of having one hall on each side, it had two to allow for that funnel of many, many people. It was a pilgrimage site. People would travel from around the empire to come to the place where Peter was crucified. St. Peter was also considered the first pope of the Catholic Church. He was the one that Jesus supposedly said upon his death, "I'm giving you the ministry after I disappear, after I die." Okay, so this is St. Paul's outside the walls in Rome, and it had a lot of characteristics that were similar to St. Peter's. When you look at this interior, it has a lot of inspiration from something. Where did it get its inspiration? Yeah.
I don't know, I kind of like to get the concept of like restoration of feeling and all the arches.
Right. It had a coiford ceiling. This is flat. A lot of these early churches had flat wooden ceilings. The Basilica of Ulpian had this. The Pantheon had it, but it had it in the dome feature. So that's totally common of ancient Rome, right? It had marble floor. It has all of those columns held up, those arches. And then at the very end, doesn't that look like a triumphant arch? Remember Arch of Titus, Arch of Constantine? And so the arch above the apse, so this is the altar area, looks like a triumphant arch. Okay, so that leads us to Santa Sabina. Santa Sabina. Okay, so when we look at the exterior of Santa Sabina, it's not all that impressive. Does anyone have any ideas why the churches might be kind of boring on the outside? Any ideas? Any educated guesses? Yeah. Roman style emphasized the interior. I love that. That is totally true, right? The Romans emphasized the interior over the exterior space. And it was great symbolism for the Christians, right? When I'm on the outside, in my world, right? I'm in my world, my everyday world. I have hardship, I have to work, I am surrounded by death, political upheaval. Santa Sabina is in the city of Rome, by the way, right? It's in the city of Rome. And so this on the outside kind of represents the ugliness and kind of the boringness of my everyday life. But then when I get to enter into a church, it is supposed to be a representation of heavenly Jerusalem. In Revelation, it speaks of the last book of the Bible, the New Testament. It speaks of heaven and this heavenly Jerusalem. And so the interiors of churches were supposed to be very impressive. They were supposed to feel very holy. Now, Santa Sabina has been altered slightly from its original construction. Most churches have. They've been altered based on the styles of all of the centuries in which it has existed. So the interior apse is now painted, but once before it probably was covered in mosaic tile, which was common during this time. And so mosaic tile, it was made out of glass, it might have gold. If I had candlelight and a dark day, kind of like today, it would shimmer, right? It would sparkle, it would feel ethereal. And it would have a flat ceiling, probably with gold embedded into it as well. Above these arches, there are mosaics that too would reflect the light and would feel like a heavenly place. So I leave the hardship of my everyday life and I enter into a sacred space. Okay, so this is what it looks like from the side aisle. And so the columns is what we call spoila. Does anyone know what that means? Spoila? They took the columns from pagan temples. And so they would often recycle parts of pagan temples and insert them into Christian structures. We see that all the time. The travertine from the Colosseum that used to cover the exterior was probably used in the construction of St. Peter's, the old one or the new one, right? They would take precious stones, they take construction parts and add them to other elements of the church. But one of the things that you see here too is that above the arches, there are clerestory windows. Do you guys remember the clerestory in the temple that we saw at Luxor, right? Remember in the hypostyle hall, there was an opening, right? So normally clerestory, actually not normally, clerestory windows are placed by the ceiling. And so that will allow natural light to come in and allow for those mosaic tiles to shimmer in this interior space. You also see that this is the apse that we're in. There's like this fencing. A lot of these early Christian churches, they basically have an altar area that's kind of fenced in. Clergy would be within this kind of fenced in area to separate it and kind of show the power of them between the common people who would come to worship here. Okay, so I apologize. I was not able to get this to the iPad to be able to work today. But what I want you to do is in your study guide, you have two diagrams. I know the bottom one looks a little funky because the boxes didn't all print for some reason. But what I'd like you to do is to label the parts, okay? And we're gonna focus on what's so important about these parts, okay? Okay, so if I start with the first one, right, the nave. Where is the nave located on this plan? This is the plan for Santa Sabina. Where is it located? The nave. A nave is a central aisle. So this right here, if you see an arrow pointing there, that is the nave, okay? That nave is the spot that you have the highest elevation. So that's the very center of the church. That's where that flat ceiling kind of comes across it. That is going to be a processional space, okay? You can have the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic Church walking down towards the altar area. It also could be a place to house pews where people can sit and participate in the Mass. Right? Now, the nave arcade, right? An arcade is a series of arches. Where's those arches going to be in this plan? What do you think? Where's the arcade going to be? Talk to your neighbors. Where do you think that is? Which part represents the arcade? Yeah.
It's the area between the walls and
Right. So this is the nave arcade. That's going to be a series of arches held up by columns that separates the nave from the side aisle. So this is the side aisle. There's only one at Santa Sabina. This is a small neighborhood church. It's not very big. Okay. So it's a small neighborhood church. So these have two side aisles, one on each side. Okay. And then the apse. All of the elements of this church are going to take our attention towards the apse. The nave is going to go to it. The side aisle is going to go to it. All the decoration is going to point us there as well, right? So where is the apse? It is that semicircular end, and that's going to be the altar end. That's the place you direct your attention to during Mass. That's where the teaching is going to happen. Okay. Okay. So that is the plan. This is what we call basically like an elevation. And so you could label the same parts here. Okay, the same parts here. This center area that we're standing right here, you have this in your study guide as well. The center part right here is the nave, right? We're focusing our attention to the apse. This is that altar area. This is the nave arcade, that series of arches that are held up by columns. Okay. Above the arcade, we have our clerestory windows that allows light in, right? And then through those columns, we can see the side aisle. Notice the altar has a triumphant-like arch at the top of it too. Okay. One of the other things you'll notice is that the ceiling of this is flat and it has coifers, just like we saw at St. Paul's outside the walls. Right? This was a very common format for early Christian churches, flat coifered ceilings. Once again, very Roman. So continuity and change, right? Continuity is it has that classical coifered ceiling, right? The continuity is it's a basilica format. The change is that it has Christian imagery, Christian symbolism to the different parts now, as well as the decoration. Now, a lot of this decoration is different today than it would have been when this was constructed way back when. It has not bronze doors, but it has wooden doors, very much like the doors that we see at the Pantheon. And this is a panel called the Ascension of Elijah. And Elijah is an Old Testament prophet, a servant of God, who also ascended into heaven. And because Jesus ascended into heaven, this is often kind of seen as that parallel between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the foretelling of Christ's coming that we see in the Old Testament. Okay, so we have some other Christian imagery. We have two images in image 50 from the Vienna Genesis. So the Vienna Genesis. We have Jacob wrestling the angel, and we have Rebecca and Eliezer at the well. Okay, so function. These are stories from Genesis. Notice this is not stories from the Bible. The Bible would be all the different books of the Bible. This is just stories from Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. Okay? If I were to make an entire Bible illustrated, it would probably take several lifetimes, right? It would take a long time for a person to make the entire Bible with illustrated pictures of it. So often in these early manuscripts, they just did the gospel, or just did a book of the gospel, or just a book of the Old Testament, like Genesis. Okay, Genesis is where we have the creation of Adam and Eve, the stories of Noah, right, are all coming from Genesis. Okay, this was most likely made for the emperor to show wealth, and we'll talk about why we think it was for the emperor in just a little bit. And then it was probably used for religious purposes. So what could those religious purposes be? It could be reinforcing Christian beliefs. It could be reinforcing, religious education. It could even be decoration. A lot of these early books were used as decoration on altars in churches. It also could just be there to show off wealth, and we'll talk about that too. Okay, now we're going to kind of look at these two images apart, but they have a lot of similarities to them. Okay, so we won't repeat a lot of this information because they'll carry through for both of them. But this is a good example of a continual narration, or what we call a continuous narration. How is the story told? Does anyone remember what a continual narration is? Yeah, Catherine. Very good. So what this basically is, it isn't, where's my element? There we go. This is the story of Jacob. And so we see Jacob at the very top of the illustration. I circled him for us. He is basically leading his family and his servants. They're on a trip. They're taking a walk. And we see him wearing these brown robes, right? He's walking and leading his family, and him and his family cross a river. And we see him again. You guys see him right here? We see him for a second time. After he crosses the river, he somehow loses his family, right? So he's crossing the river, he loses his family, and for some apparent reason, he meets a man and he decides he needs to wrestle this guy. I don't understand why, right? But the man turns out to be an angel. And so he wrestles this angel. So we see him for the third time, right? He wrestles him. He realizes this guy is an angel. And so he asks for a blessing. You guys see? He's repeated for the fourth time here with the angel. He's bowed down. It looks like he's kissing his hand. And then eventually he finds his family again and continues on his journey. Now, this is significant in Genesis because he changes his name after this experience and changes his name to Israel. And then, of course, Israel is the land of the Jews, right? And so this is, he basically is representing the Jewish people after this time, right? So that's like the content, that's the imagery that we see, or the main storyline. But you'll also notice some elements that are very classical, right? You'll see that he's crossing a bridge and there are columns on that bridge. You see allusions to landscape, which the Romans love to do. We see trees, we see the river, we see rounded arches, we see classical drapery, right? Notice what they're wearing, how it cascades, how we see the knees pressing through the fabric. Okay, so there's many classical elements to this. Where else have we seen continual narrations? Yeah. Column of Trajan, the Book of the Dead, right? With Hunifer, right? The book of the story of how we continue into, or how we weigh our souls into the afterlife, right? How it's similar, we just talked about, right? So context, how does it represent the wealth of the owner? Okay, how does it represent the wealth of the owner? Did anyone do any of the reading on this? Anyone know? This was dyed with violet. And we just talked about this when we looked at that image of Jesus in the violet and the purple robes. That color was so hard to get. It was really reserved for the emperor or the royal families. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we think it was probably made for the emperor, is because it was dyed purple. Now it doesn't look purple anymore. Time and history has faded it, but it would have once been a very luminous violet color. And the writing that now is tarnished is in silver. So it was written in silver ink. And so think about this. This would have been purple and silver. And just like the interior of Santa Sabina, it would have felt incredibly holy. It would sparkle and shimmer. Okay? And then the form of it, what is the painting made from? This is on vellum. Okay, I draw on vellum all the time, but mine is synthetic vellum. Vellum is made out of calf skin. It's not cow skin, it's calf skin. So they would take young calves and they would basically make a paper very similar to kind of some of the procedures we would use to make leather, but they would beat it so thin, right? And they would basically smooth it out so much that it's transparent. You can actually see through it. Today, it's very similar to like tracing paper. Like vellum, when you buy vellum to draw on, it's like a thicker version of this tracing paper, so you can see through it. It was very, very thin. And they would be able to dye it and paint on it. So a lot of these early images not only had text, but they also had illustrations on them. Okay, so it's what we call an illumination. An illumination is an illustrated manuscript, an illustrated manuscript. It often would have things like initials, borders, miniature illustrations. So miniature just means small illustrations. Sometimes we also use the word miniatures to talk about these illustrations in books. And often they were painted in gold or silver, but they don't have to be. Often we call them illuminated manuscripts, but illuminated manuscripts are the ones with gold and silver. So this pertains to both pieces, Jacob as well as Rebecca. Okay, the story of Rebecca also comes from Genesis, of course, because it's the Vienna Genesis. It comes from Genesis 24. And it's basically the story of Abraham trying to find a wife for his son Isaac. And so Abraham sends his servant, right? This guy with the camels here. He sends his servant to go find a wife. And so while he's going to find a wife, his camels get thirsty, and he's trying to find water for them. And this Rebecca offers to help him get water. And so because of her service to him, he brings her back, and she becomes the wife of Isaac. So this too is a continual narration. Notice how we see Rebecca twice here. Right, we see her twice in the image. Oh, okay, I have a close-up on it. This is a really good example of what these miniatures will often look like. Is the scale realistic? No. The whole point here is to try to get across the most important information. So she's leaving a city. You guys see the city? It's like in miniature. It reminds me of the Palette of Namar, how we have those little structures, right? So we have this little fortified city here, and she leaves the city, and then the big opening there that tells me kind of she's leaving that entryway. And she goes upon a road that has classical columns on it. Along the river, there's an image here. What the heck is that? We have a semi-nude woman holding a wreath. What could she be? Any educated guesses? She's like yeah, go ahead. A Venus and Aphrodite. She's like a classical water nymph. She's like the symbol of the water. So we don't see classicism disappear even in meaning, right? So she's a representation of the water, and then we actually see the water, right? And so then we have that meaning, and we have a little bit of rendering of value so that they look three-dimensional. So classical elements with columns, we have the personification, we have drapery, we have overlapping space and value. I forgot to add the value on the list. Now, as we wrap up, I have a couple other things to look at. This is the Rebella Gospels. The Gospels, we don't have an image set. They are also early manuscript illuminations. Basically on this one, the text would be on the extra page. So there would be a page on the left that would have the scripture on it, and then the other page would just be an illustration. Now, the reason I want to show this is kind of comparing these different styles of illuminations, the illustrations of these books, okay? When you look at this scene, right, notice how it's kind of like central orientated, right? This illustration looks a lot like an altar would have during early Christian or Byzantine era. It'd be central focus. We have the imagery of like the crucifixion in the center, right? This is from the gospel, so this is all taken from the secret of, trying to think of the word, I got a piece of the Mondays again. The stories of his death. I know there's a more technical term of it. So we see Christ being crucified with other Romans on the side, the thieves. We see the Romans sticking him with spears on the ends, and the vinegar-soaked rags where they're trying to make him be in extra pain, right? And then at the very bottom of it, we have a scene of the resurrection. So we have the empty tomb, and we have Jesus kind of leaving the tomb, and Mary seeing the angel. So these are stories from the Gospels. And then this is the ascension into heaven. So here we have the ascension into heaven, and around Jesus as he ascends into heaven, we have the symbols of those Gospels, those four evangelists. So we have the angel with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have them in human form as they ascend up into heaven, as well as their personifications that here, underneath that full body mandola, he's in that heaven as he ascends up. And then at the very bottom, we have a representation of Mary, right? Mary is wearing what color of robes? Purple. So she's like the queen of heaven, right here. And she's given kind of queenly sort of a royal sort of status. So we can see that she has her arms raised up, like our Oric figure at Santa Priscilla. Excuse me, at the catacombs of Priscilla. Okay, so that's all we have for today. We'll continue looking at Byzantine art tomorrow.